The morning Deacon Preston read her out of the family cabin, there was frost on the inside of the window glass, and Bo could see her breath in the kitchen where she had slept on a corn shuck pallet since her father's cough had filled every room of the house, and then gone quiet forever. She was 15 years old, and she had not yet understood that the ground Deacon was putting her off of would turn out to be the least valuable piece of earth she would ever leave behind. Deacon was not a cruel man in the way that men who shout and strike are cruel. He was cruel the way a closing door is cruel, efficient and without ceremony. He told her there were 4 mouths in that cabin already, and winter was coming, and she was old enough to find her own way. He said it at the table, with his wife, Marta, looking at the flour sack on the counter, and Bo heard every word clearly because she had been expecting something like it since the day they lowered Elias Preston into the churchyard ground, and Deacon had come to stand beside the grave with the expression of a man calculating what he had just inherited and what he had just been burdened with. She took Rue because Rue had been her father's mule, and Deacon had no real argument for keeping her. She took 40 pounds of provisions in 2 canvas sacks, a wool blanket her father had used in the field, and Elias's worn leather journal, which Deacon had not even noticed on the shelf beside the door, because he had never seen his brother write in it, only carry it, and so had no idea what it held. If he had looked inside, he might have kept it. He did not look. Bo did not go toward the valley town. She went uphill because the valley held nothing she had been offered a place in, and because she had been on the granite shelf of Colder Ridge with her father before, when he had been hired to assess stone for a man who wanted a mill foundation and never built it. She remembered the way the shelf sat back from the prevailing wind, and how her father had crouched and pressed both palms flat against the granite, and said that was the kind of ground that did not negotiate. She had been 11 then. She had not known she was memorizing anything. If you are finding this channel for the first time, this is the kind of story we tell here, and there are many more like it waiting. Consider staying a while. The shelf was about 2 miles up the east face of Colder Ridge, above the tree line at its lower edge, and below a 40-foot granite outcropping that would block a north wind the way a raised shoulder blocks a thrown handful of gravel. Bo arrived in late August of 1887, with Rue breathing steady behind her, and her provisions strapped across the mule's back, and the journal inside her coat against her ribs. She had spent the last of the walk thinking about timber, because that was what every person in the valley would have told her to use, and because she had also spent 4 years watching her father work stone and listening to him explain why certain materials outlasted the people who worked them and certain materials did not. She sat on the granite shelf that first evening and opened the journal by the last of the light. Elias had written in it the way a stonemason writes, which is to say practically in short notations besides small sketches, with measurements given in fractions and load estimates rendered as simple arithmetic she could follow if she worked slowly. He had recorded the coursework methods he had learned from his own teacher, a man named Hugh Alderman, who had walled stone in the Virginia highlands and then moved west, and who had taught Elias that dry stone construction without mortar was not a poverty of means, but a discipline of fit, that the wall held because each stone was chosen and placed to bear the weight of everything above it, and to distribute that weight evenly into the ground. Mortar, Hugh had told Elias, and Elias had written it down, and Bo now read it in the dimming light. Mortar hides poor fit. If the stones do not rest true without it, they will not rest true with it. The mortar only delays the failure. She read that line twice, and then she closed the journal and lay back on the granite and looked at the sky and thought about what she was going to build. The valley men came up to look at her in September, not because they were concerned, but because she had become something to see. 3 of them rode up on a Saturday morning, Harlan Cabe among them. Harlan, who owned the general store in Colder Creek, and who had an opinion about everything that happened within 4 miles of his counter. He was a broad man with a permanent expression of mild amusement, the kind of amusement that substitutes for thinking in men who have never needed to think very hard. He looked at the trench Bo had cut along the shelf's edge and at the courses she had already laid, 6 inches wide at the base and angled back very slightly from vertical, and he looked at the absence of any timber, any frame, any ridgepole, and he said, "What is this meant to be, girl?" Bo told him it was going to be a house. Harlan looked at the other 2 men and they looked at him, and then he looked back at Bo and said, "It looks like a hole." The name fastened almost immediately. By October, it was the girl's folly up on the granite shelf. By November, when the first light snow came, and Bo had laid the east wall to shoulder height and begun the earth berm work on the north side, the folly had been promoted in Harlan's telling to a monument to stubbornness and a waste of good rock. He said this on the store porch where the men of Colder Creek conducted their public philosophy in the hours between mid-morning and noon, and the men on the porch agreed with him in the comfortable way men agree when they have no reason not to. One woman said something different. Nettie Cabe, Harlan's own wife, had ridden up to the shelf in early October to bring Bo a covered dish of food that Bo had not asked for, and she had stood at the edge of the work and watched Bo settle a flat-faced piece of granite into the 3rd course of the south wall, and she had said that it looked solid to her. Nettie was not a woman who argued with her husband in public, and she did not repeat the observation on the store porch, so it was lost to the general conversation. But she had said it, and Bo had heard her. The work went slowly because it was meant to. Elias's journal described the pace of good stonework in a line Bo returned to when the days shortened and her hands bled from the cold. A wall that is laid quickly is a wall that is laid for the layer, not the stone. She was laying it for the stone and for whatever weight the winters of that ridge would eventually put on it. The design came together from the journal's notes and from the specific qualities of the site. She set the hut into the slope, so the rear wall and the 2 long walls were earth berm to a height of about 3 feet, with the exposed granite of the ridge filling the role of a 4th wall at the back. The roof she planned low, nearly flat at 12 degrees, with a load-bearing timber ridgepole she cut from a deadfall spruce and seated into mortise notches in the stone. The walls themselves she built to 18 inches of thickness, double-coursed with rubble, filled between faces, and the combined mass of the stone and the banked earth meant the interior temperature would hold whatever heat she put into it, the way a cast-iron skillet holds heat after the fire goes out. The recessed entry was her own addition to the journal's methods, or rather it was the conclusion she drew from a note her father had written about a byre he had walled for a farmer in the Virginia highlands, where the entry had been set at an angle to the prevailing wind. She dug her entry tunnel 4 feet into the slope before it opened into the main space, and she angled it 15 degrees off the wind line so that a person coming in had to turn once before reaching the interior door. The valley men who came up to look that autumn said the tunnel was extra foolishness, more labor for no return. Harlan Cabe said she was building herself a rabbit warren. She finished the main walls in November of 1887 and the roof in the early weeks of 1888, working through cold that left the stones slick with frost each morning. She sealed the roof with layered spruce bark and a clay she had found at the shelf's lower edge, mixed with the fine rock dust from her quarrying. She fitted a small iron stove she had traded 40 pounds of dressed stone for, with a farrier 2 miles down the valley road, running the stovepipe up through the south wall below the eave. She laid in enough split wood to last 3 months, stacked along the east interior wall. She cut a 3-inch air gap below the tunnel entrance and fitted it with a wooden block she could open or close from inside. so she could pull fresh air in or seal against wind without opening the main door. When she stood inside the finished hut for the first time with the stove lit and the entry tunnel behind her, she put both palms flat against the interior stone wall, the way her father had pressed his hands to the granite shelf 4 years before, and she felt the warmth the stone had already begun to hold. And she thought of Elias writing his notes in the lamplight, and of Hugh Alderman somewhere in the Virginia highlands, explaining that the fit of the stone was the whole argument. The valley had 3 mild winters after that. The winters of 1888, 1889, and 1890 came and went with modest snowfall and no sustained cold that tested timber walls in any serious way. This was misfortune of the ordinary kind, the kind that looks like providence while it is happening. The men on Harlan's porch had a new name for Bo by 1890, and the name was the Ridge Hermit, delivered with the gentle contempt reserved for people who have chosen to be eccentric rather than practical. Harlan had been up to look at the finished hut once, in the spring of 1889, and he had stood in the entry tunnel and said it smelled like a root cellar, and that Bo had done a lot of work to live worse than a person in the valley. He said this pleasantly, the way he said most things, and rode back down. Bo had, by that point, expanded the hut's interior storage, dug a cold cellar beneath the floor stones, traded dressed stone for preserved food and additional fodder stock, and built a second sleeping platform above the first along the east wall. She had 2 more wool blankets, a better iron pot, a set of candle molds, and a large quantity of rendered tallow. She had also cut and stacked nearly twice the firewood she calculated she would need for the worst winter she could reasonably imagine, because her father's journal contained a note from Hugh Alderman about the winters of the 1850s in the Virginia highlands, and the note ended with a sentence Bo had copied onto the inside cover of the journal in her own hand. Provision for what you cannot see coming, and double what you think you need for what you can. She had read that sentence on a morning in the autumn of 1891, while watching a sky over Colder Ridge that was the wrong color for October, a greenish, low pressure pressing from the northwest that her father had described once as the kind of sky that is making up its mind, and she had gone back to her wood stack and estimated and then cut more. January of 1892 came in quietly for 4 days, and then it did not come in quietly anymore. The snow began on the 9th, a Sunday in the late afternoon, with a wind from the northwest that arrived before the snow, the way a sound arrives before the thing that made it. By Monday morning, there were 18 inches on the ground in the valley, and the temperature had dropped to a point where the sap in the green-cut pine of the newer cabin walls began to freeze and expand, and the nails to lose their grip. By Wednesday, 3 days into the storm, the first of the valley's lighter-built cabins had its roof partially collapse under snow load, a cabin belonging to a young couple named Wister, who had built in the spring with unseasoned timber and more optimism than lumber knowledge. They got out safely, but the cabin was finished. The valley learned about Bo's hut the way information spreads in an emergency, which is to say urgently and without embarrassment about the asking. A man named Cass Farley, whose own roof had begun to sag on the 4th day, loaded his wife and 2 daughters onto his draft horse and rode up through snow that was chest-high in the cuts, and arrived at Bo's entry tunnel on a Thursday afternoon with ice in his beard and his younger daughter wrapped in his coat. Bo opened the door and took them in. She did not say anything, except that there was room, and the stove was drawing well. Over the next 4 days, 8 more people came up the mountain. They came in pairs and alone, and once in a group of 3, and Bo took them all in because the hut's thermal mass held the interior temperature steady, while the valley was getting through the coldest night of the storm, with frostbite reports from every household that still had a household. 9 people sheltered inside the hut by the 2nd week of the blizzard. Rue was inside along the east wall because the snow had buried the small lean-to shelter Bo had built outside, and the mule's presence in the closed space added a noticeable amount of warmth that Bo did not mention and everyone felt. A child named Bess Farley, 6 years old, fell asleep against Rue's flank on the 8th day of the storm, and her mother left her there because the mule was warm and steady and clearly not troubled by the arrangement. The entry tunnel proved itself on the 14th night, which was the coldest night of the blizzard. The temperature outside dropped below anything the valley had recorded since the county had a weather observer. The interior of every timber cabin still standing registered cold enough to freeze water in a ceramic basin by morning. Inside Bo's hut, with 9 people and a mule, and the stove running at a moderate draw, the temperature stayed above freezing by a margin that everyone inside could feel in their hands and faces, and that none of them could account for until Bo explained, quietly and once, that the tunnel broke the wind before it reached the door, and the door had no direct path from outside, cold to inside air. She did not say she had planned this. She did not need to. 11 valley cabins failed or were vacated during those 19 days, either from structural collapse, from heat loss that rendered them uninhabitable, or from chimney failures that left families with no way to make fire. Not one person inside Bo's hut on Colder Ridge suffered frostbite or smoke damage, or a cold serious enough to require a doctor's visit when the valley was accessible again. Rue came through with her winter coat and her disposition intact. The blizzard broke on the 28th of January. The snow had reached a depth of 4 feet on the level ground of the valley floor, and considerably more in the cuts and lee sides of buildings. The morning it cleared, Bo stood at the entrance of the tunnel and looked out at Colder Ridge, white and still and brilliant under a returned sun, and she felt a quiet that was not emptiness but the specific quiet of something having been decided. People left the hut over the next 2 days as the valley trails became passable. They left carefully and with a different quality of departure than they had arrived with, less urgent and more measured, saying things like, "Thank you, and we will send word when we are settled," and most of them looked at the walls on their way out with the expression of people revising an opinion they had held for a long time. Harlan Cabe had not come up the mountain during the blizzard. He had a well-built cabin by the standards of the valley, and it had held, though by the final days of the storm, his firewood was so reduced that he and Nettie had been burning furniture to keep the stove going, and the cabin had still dropped cold enough to kill all but 4 of the glass seedling starts Nettie kept on the windowsill through the winter. He came up in March when the snow had settled and the trail was passable to a horse, and Nettie came with him. She had been the first person to say the walls looked solid 3 years before, and she rode behind her husband with her hands folded and her face composed in a way that suggested she was waiting for something to happen. Harlan tied his horse at the lower edge of the shelf and walked to Bo's entry tunnel and stood at the outer opening for a moment before he bent slightly and stepped in. Bo was inside, mending a leather strap, and she heard his boots in the tunnel and set the strap down. He came through the inner door and stood in the hut, which was 15 by 12 feet of interior space, with a stone floor and walls that had accumulated 2 winters of soot above the stovepipe joint, and 3 winters of use in the way a space accumulates the evidence of someone living carefully inside it. He stood there and looked at the south wall and the roof joint and the east sleeping platform and the fitted air gap below the tunnel entrance, and then he looked at Elias's journal where it sat on the shelf beside the stove. He picked it up. He opened it to a page near the front, where Elias had written the load-bearing calculations for a double-coursed 18-inch wall, and he looked at the numbers for a while without speaking. Then he read one line aloud, not the line Bo had copied on the inside cover, but a simpler one her father had written near the top of the first page. "Work the stone until the stone agrees." He set the journal down on the shelf exactly where he had found it. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet, Nettie stepped in from the tunnel behind him and stood with her hands at her sides, and her eyes were full, though she did not let anything fall. Harlan said, "I had you wrong." He said it plainly, without performance, the way a man says a true thing that costs him, and then he did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that the moment required. Bo looked at him for a moment and then looked at the journal on the shelf. She said that her father had had most of it right, and that she had learned the rest from the stones themselves. That was the whole of it. That exchange in the low stone room, with the winter light coming through the south-facing slit window, and Rue nosing at the lean-to door outside. It was not a dramatic scene by the standards of dramatic scenes. No one wept openly except Nettie, and she wept quietly, with one hand pressed to her mouth, looking at the wall. Word of what Bo's hut had held through the blizzard moved through the valley the way useful information moves through a community that has recently learned what it did not know. By the spring of 1892, 4 men had come up separately to ask Bo about the coursework methods, standing outside the hut and looking at the double-faced walls and asking specific questions about the angle of the batter and the rubble fill between faces. Bo answered them all, plainly and at length, showing what could be shown and explaining what had to be explained in words. She had no interest in withholding the method. The method was her father's gift and Hugh Alderman's before that, and gifts of that kind were not diminished by being passed on. Harlan Cave sent 3 men from the valley to work alongside Bo for 2 weeks that summer, learning the dry stone method by doing it, helping Bo extend the lean-to into a proper stone outbuilding for Rue's winter shelter. He did not call it repayment. He called it sending men to learn a useful trade, which it also was, and Bo accepted the help without marking the distinction. Through the early 1890s, Bo taught the earth berm and dry stone methods to anyone who asked, and the asking increased each year as the memory of January 1892 stayed fresh in the valley. A man named Aldred Tanner, who had been one of the 9 sheltered in the hut, became a capable dry stone waller by 1895 and built 2 outbuildings and a root cellar annex using the methods, and he in turn taught his neighbor, and the neighbor taught the neighbor's brother-in-law who had come down from a settlement farther up the ridge, and in that way the method moved outward the way knowledge moves when it is genuinely useful, not by proclamation, but by application. Bo herself remained on the granite shelf. She did not go back to the valley to live, though she came down often enough to trade stonework for what the shelf could not produce, and to teach when teaching was wanted. She became, in the way of people who are right for long enough, simply part of what the valley knew about itself, a woman on a ridge who knew stone the way her father had known it, and who had kept 9 people warm through the worst winter in the county's memory and asked nothing for it afterward. Deacon Preston's cabin had been among the 11 that failed in January 1892. He had made it through the storm by sheltering with his neighbors, not at Bo's hut, and he had not come up the ridge that spring or any other spring. Bo did not seek him out and did not speak of him. Whatever she carried about Deacon, she carried it without display, which was her way with most things. By the late 1890s, several families in the valley had built or rebuilt with earth berm elements, setting their rear walls into the hillside and thickening their construction in the ways Bo's hut had demonstrated. None of them replicated the hut exactly, because the specific qualities of the granite shelf that had made it possible on Colder Ridge were not available at every site, but the principles transferred: the thermal mass of thick walls, the berm as insulation, the angled entry as windbreak, the deliberate overstock of fuel and provisions against a winter that had not arrived yet, but was always possible. The method became regional habit before it became regional knowledge, which is the direction useful things usually travel. Elias's journal was the thing that formalized it. Bo had allowed Aldred Tanner to copy it in 1897, sitting at her stone table for 2 days with a clean ledger book and a careful hand, transcribing every calculation and every notation and every small sketch. Aldred made a second copy for himself and sent the first to a schoolmaster in the next county, over who had written to ask about the walling methods after hearing about the 1892 blizzard from a circuit rider. The schoolmaster made 4 copies and distributed them to families he thought would use them. And by 1905, Bo knew of copies in 3 counties, though there may have been more she did not know about. The journal Elias had carried in his coat through the Virginia highlands and the Tennessee uplands, and finally to Colder Creek, had become something her father had not lived to intend it as, a manual in use by working hands in 3 counties, which was the kind of life she thought he would have wanted for it. She grew into the hut the way a tree grows into a wound it has been made to close around, not ignoring the wound, but incorporating it into the shape of the thing the tree becomes. The shelf was her ground, and she worked it with Rue until Rue was old and slow and spent her days in the stone outbuilding pressed against the warm east wall, the way she had pressed against the same wall in January 1892, with little Bess Farley sleeping against her flank. Bo added a small south-facing window, wider than the original slit, in 1901, because she had earned enough light to let herself have it. She built a proper stone step at the tunnel entrance in 1904, fitted and level, dressed on top with a fine-toothed chisel, the way Elias had dressed the sills of the mill foundations he was proud of. She planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing slope below the shelf, walled on its lower 3 sides with dry stone terrace walls that would have been recognizable to anyone who had read the journal. The original valley cabins, the ones that had been built with green-cut timber and confidence in the mild winters of the late 1880s, were rebuilt or substantially reconstructed between 1892 and 1910, most of them more than once. Timber frames weathered and heaved and settled, and the communities that lived in them adjusted and rebuilt, which was the nature of timber in a mountain climate, and no failure of the people who used it. But Bo's hut on the granite shelf of Colder Ridge stood through those same decades without significant repair, only maintenance. The roof clay refreshed every few years, the tunnel entrance lintel reset once after a frost heave, the stovepipe replaced when it rusted through. The walls themselves did not move. The stone Elias's notes had taught her to fit, and that she had fitted carefully across the autumn and winter of 1887 and 1888, sat in the same courses and the same angles as the day she had laid them, distributing their load the way Hugh Alderman had described to Elias in the Virginia highlands, the way the weight of everything above was held by the care of everything below. There is a kind of inheritance that cannot be itemized in a will, or argued over in a probate court, or diminished by the opinions of people who were not present when it was given. It lives in the hands. It passes from hand to hand by showing, and it outlasts the stone of its first making, because it can always be made again somewhere else from whatever is at hand. People who came to the ridge in the years after the blizzard, and who looked at the hut and at the courses of its walls, sometimes said it looked as though it had grown there, as though the shelf had simply risen into that shape over time, and the shape had always been correct. Bo, when she heard this, did not correct it or explain it away. She thought it was probably close enough to true. Rue died in the autumn of 1908, in the stone outbuilding with its thick walls, at an age that was well past what a working mule could reasonably be expected to reach. Bo buried her at the edge of the shelf in the shallow soil over the granite, and set a flat-faced stone at the head of the grave, dressed level on its top face, fitted into the ground the way her father had taught her a foundation stone was fitted, patient and exact, and meant to stay. In the years after that, Bo continued to come down to the valley when stonework was wanted, and when the valley asked her to teach, and she continued to be the kind of person the valley had once written off and later learned to ask for by name. She was not celebrated in any formal sense. There was no marker placed, no ceremony held. The knowledge spread and was used and was passed on, and the hut stood on the granite shelf as it had stood since 1888, low and earth-pressed and south-facing, its recessed tunnel breathing the cold air of Colder Ridge winters quietly and without comment. The last time Harlan Cabe came up the mountain, he was an older man and he came alone, without announcement, on a morning in the early spring of 1910 when the snow had pulled back from the shelf and the granite was wet and dark in the sun. He stood at the entry tunnel for a moment before going in, the same way he had stood there in March of 1892, and he put one hand against the outer face of the south wall, the flat of his palm against the stone, and he held it there for a moment the way a person holds their hand to something to feel whether it is real. Bo watched him from inside, through the slit window, and did not go out. He stayed for about an hour. They talked about the valley and about the copies of the journal, and about a young man in the next settlement over who had built a stone root cellar the previous summer, and done it reasonably well for a first attempt. Harlan said the young man had used the journal for his measurements and that the walls were plumb and the roof joint was tight. Bo said she was glad to hear it. When Harlan left, he paused in the tunnel entrance and looked back at her, and she thought he was going to say something, but he did not. He turned and went out into the spring light. She listened to his horse moving down the trail until she could not hear it anymore. And then she put her palms flat on the south wall, the way she had done the winter she finished it, and felt the stone warm from the morning sun, and felt the coarsework under her hands, each stone bearing what was put upon it and distributing the weight into everything below. Elias's journal sat on the shelf beside the stove, worn soft along its spine, its pages a little warped from years of a damp mountain climate. It had its copies in 3 counties now, and those copies had copies, and some of those copies were in hands that had never heard of Colder Ridge and did not know where the method had come from. That was all right. The method did not need a name attached to it to work. It needed only the patience to learn the stones and the time to set them true. And somewhere on a granite shelf on a mountain that is not called Colder Ridge anymore, not by that name, not by any name the maps give it now, a hut built by a girl of 15 with her dead father's knowledge and 40 pounds of provisions, and a mule named Rue still stands with its south wall in the light and its entry tunnel angled against the wind, its stones resting in the courses she laid, the weight of everything above them held by the fit of everything below.